The moment I remember most clearly isn't the morning I walked into that conference room 10 years later. It isn't the look on Victor Langford's face when he finally understood what had been happening beneath his feet for a decade. It isn't the silence, though the silence was extraordinary, the kind of silence that fills a room when power changes hands so completely that the people losing it can't even find the words to pretend otherwise. No. The moment I remember most clearly is a Tuesday afternoon in October, when I was 22 years old, sitting in a glass-walled meeting room on the 14th floor of Langford Mercer and Associates, and the most powerful man in that building looked at me across a mahogany table and said, with absolute calm, absolute certainty, and not a single trace of guilt, "You should be grateful we're only terminating the internship." I want you to sit with that for a second. Grateful. I had worked 80-hour weeks for 3 months. I had produced analysis that their senior associates hadn't been able to generate in 6. I had found something real, something that should have mattered. And I had done exactly what every textbook, every professor, every mentor had told me to do. I reported it through the proper channel. I put it in writing. I submitted it with citations and timestamps, and a clear professional memo to the man who was supposed to be guiding me. And 2 days later, in a glass room 14 floors above the rest of the city, he told me I should be grateful. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at Victor Langford across that table, and I nodded, and I stood up, and I left. But I want to be very precise about something, because this is important, and I think most people get this part wrong when they tell stories like mine. I didn't leave with a plan. I didn't walk out of that building with my jaw set and my eyes hard, and some cinematic sense of purpose. I left with nothing. I left shaking. I left so hollowed out that I sat in my car in the parking structure for 40 minutes before I could make myself start the engine, and even then I drove home on autopilot, not entirely sure how I arrived. That emptiness, that specific, particular kind of emptiness, is the part nobody talks about. They talk about the comeback. They talk about the revenge. They don't talk about what it actually feels like to have something you worked your entire life toward dismantled in a single afternoon, while the person doing the dismantling tells you to be grateful for the mercy of it. Here is what I want you to understand before I tell you what happened next. I am telling you this story not because it ends well, though it does in ways I couldn't have imagined at 22, but because the distance between that parking garage and that conference room 10 years later is made of something specific. It is not made of talent alone. It is not made of luck. It is not made of righteous anger, though I had plenty of that. It is made of patience. It is made of discipline so absolute that it sometimes felt indistinguishable from damage, and it is made of the one advantage they never thought to account for. When they decided to erase me, I had nothing left to lose, and they had everything left to protect. That asymmetry, in the end, was all I needed. Let me take you back to where it actually started, because even the beginning of this story contains a lesson that I spent years learning the hard way, and maybe if you hear it now, it saves you some of what it cost me. I grew up in a mid-sized city in the Midwest, the kind of place where ambition is considered a slightly embarrassing quality, something to be kept quiet, like a strange hobby or a family secret. My father drove a city bus. He had driven the same route for 19 years by the time I started university, and he knew every regular passenger by name, and he was proud of that. My mother worked night shifts as a registered nurse at the regional hospital, and she came home smelling of antiseptic and institutional coffee, and she was proud of that too. They were both, in their own ways, genuinely happy people, genuinely content, and I loved them deeply, and I still do. But from the time I was about 12 years old, I understood something that I didn't quite have the language for yet. The system that produced their contentment was designed very precisely to stay exactly where it was, not because the system was cruel exactly, but because the system had never been designed with people like us in mind, and contentment, genuine, dignified contentment, was the best available option when the actual door is locked from the inside. I decided at 12 years old to find the door. I was a strange student, not in the way that gets romanticized, not the misunderstood genius type who doodled in notebooks during class and turned out to be secretly brilliant. I was strange in a more uncomfortable way. I worked relentlessly, methodically. I built systems for studying. I tracked my own performance. I read things I wasn't assigned because I understood even then that the gap between what a school teaches you and what the real world rewards is enormous, and the only way to close that gap is to close it yourself. By my second year of university, studying finance and economics, I had developed a reputation among the faculty as the student most likely to ask questions that made the professor pause, not to show off, genuinely because I wanted to understand the answer. The department head, I'll call him the professor because that's what he was to me, pulled me aside halfway through my junior year and told me he had recommended me for a placement at Langford Mercer and Associates. He said it like he was handing me something rare, which he was. The firm had dominated financial consulting in the city for over 30 years. It had the kind of institutional power that becomes invisible because it has been there so long, the kind of firm whose name appears in the footnotes of major municipal contracts, whose partners sit on the boards of hospitals and universities, whose alumni populate City Hall and the federal district offices. Getting a placement there as an undergraduate was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. My mother cried when I told her. My father shook my hand and then hugged me for a long time without saying anything, which was his version of crying. I stayed up until 3 a.m. that night, reading everything I could find about the firm's history, its major clients, its publicly known projects. I made notes. I cross-referenced. I prepared. I was prepared for all the wrong things. There is a very particular kind of institution, and if you have ever been inside one, you will recognize this immediately, where the official culture and the operational culture exist on entirely separate planes. The official culture is what appears in the recruitment brochure, what the senior partners say at orientation, what gets written up in business school case studies. The operational culture is what actually governs everything, and in most elite firms, the operational culture has one rule above all others, one axiom so fundamental that it is never stated explicitly because it doesn't need to be. People like you exist to serve people like us. I understood this within 72 hours of arriving. The intern cohort that year had 16 people. 4 of them had fathers who were either clients of the firm or political allies of the senior partners. 2 of them had gone to the same prep school as Gerald Whitmore, the managing partner. 1 of them, Bradley Caldwell, whose father ran one of the largest commercial real estate portfolios in the state, arrived on the first day and was immediately pulled aside for a private lunch with Victor Langford himself. I remember watching that happen from the open floor of the associate bullpen, Langford appearing in the doorway, calling Caldwell's name with a kind of warm familiarity that suggested he had known the name before he ever saw the face, and the 2 of them disappearing toward the elevator while the rest of us went through an orientation presentation delivered by an HR administrator who kept losing her place in the slides. I remember thinking, this is the division, right here. This is the actual structure of this place. The rest of us, the 12 who didn't have fathers at the table, were assigned to the analysis support pool. We ran data. We formatted reports. We updated models that had been built years ago by people who were now partners, models that were slightly broken in ways nobody had bothered to fix, because fixing them would require acknowledging they'd been wrong. We worked late. We worked weekends. We received almost no direct feedback and were told this was normal, and that learning happened by osmosis in environments like this one. I absorbed everything anyway. I want to be honest with you here, because I think the honest version of this story is more useful than the flattering version. I wasn't purely noble in those early weeks. Part of what drove me was genuine curiosity. The firm's work was genuinely interesting. The intersection of financial analysis and institutional power was something I found intellectually compelling in a way that was close to physical. But part of what drove me was something uglier and more honest. I was furious. I watched Bradley Caldwell receive mentorship that I had been explicitly told was not available to the support pool. I watched him make mistakes in front of partners and receive corrections offered as helpful guidance. I watched myself and the 11 others in my tier execute flawless work and receive nothing. No feedback, no visibility, no acknowledgement that the reports we were building were being put in front of the firm's most important clients with different names on the cover. That fury was real. I am not going to dress it up as something more dignified. But I also want to be clear about what I did with the fury, because this is the part that mattered. I didn't let it make me reckless. I let it make me meticulous. And somewhere around week 6, that meticulousness is what found it. I had been assigned to update a set of financial models for a cluster of regional manufacturing clients, mid-sized companies, not particularly glamorous, the kind of work that got assigned to support pool interns precisely because it wasn't glamorous. I was 3 hours into the task when I noticed something in the transaction logs that felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately name. I went back and looked at it again. Then I pulled up the historical records for one of the other companies in the cluster, then a third. Then I spent 4 hours cross-referencing everything against publicly available market data and regulatory filings that were technically outside my assignment but accessible through the firm's database subscriptions. What I found, when I put it all together, was a pattern. The firm, or an entity closely connected to it, in ways that were obscured by enough corporate layers to require real attention to trace, had been systematically identifying financially vulnerable mid-market companies, taking small quiet stake positions through intermediary vehicles, and then providing financial consulting services that, on paper, looked like support, but in practice tended to produce valuation assessments significantly below actual market value. Those assessments then became the basis for acquisition offers. The companies, desperate, accepted. The acquiring entity, which the intermediary vehicles pointed back toward, took control for fractions of actual value. It wasn't impossible that there were legitimate explanations for some of what I was seeing. I knew that. I was 22 and I knew I didn't have the full picture, but the pattern was coherent enough and consistent enough across enough instances that it seemed to me like something a responsible professional was obligated to flag. So I wrote it up. 4 pages, organized clearly, careful language. I made sure to write potential pattern and appears to suggest rather than anything accusatory. I included all my sources, all my timestamps, all my data references. I sent it to Curtis Mercer. Curtis was the junior partner who had been nominally assigned as my internship supervisor. He was in his mid-30s, pleasant enough, the kind of person who gave the impression of being genuinely decent while occupying a system that required him not to be. I had spoken to him maybe 6 times in 6 weeks, always briefly, always in passing, but he was the designated channel, and so I used the channel. I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to think about this honestly, because I have thought about it 10,000 times since then. If you were me, 22 years old, working at a place that had already told you clearly where you stood, having found something that seemed genuinely wrong, what would you have done? Put it in the comments. I mean that, because I have met people who say they would have gone straight to a regulator, and people who say they would have buried it and said nothing, and people who say they would have done exactly what I did. And I've come to think that what you would actually do in that moment says something very specific about what you believe about institutions and whether they can be trusted to correct themselves. I believed they could. That belief was, at 22, the most expensive thing I owned. 2 days passed. Then Curtis Mercer sent me a calendar invitation for a meeting titled Internship Review. I accepted it, not yet alarmed. The meeting was scheduled for 2:30 on a Thursday. When I arrived at the indicated conference room, Curtis was not there alone. Victor Langford was there. Gerald Whitmore was there. A woman I didn't recognize, who I would later learn was the firm's general counsel, was there. and there was a printed copy of my memo on the table, annotated in red ink. Victor Langford did not raise his voice. He was, if anything, extraordinarily composed. He explained to me, in measured and precise language, that I had accessed confidential financial records outside the scope of my assignment. He explained that doing so constituted a violation of the firm's internal data protocols, which I had signed at orientation. He explained that the findings I believed I had made were the result of a misunderstanding of complex corporate structures that naturally required years of experience to properly interpret. He explained that the firm took these matters very seriously and that, accordingly, my internship would be terminated effective immediately, and that the university would be informed of the circumstances. He did all of this in approximately 8 minutes. Then he looked at me and said, "You should be grateful we're only terminating the internship." And here is what I want you to understand about that moment. I was not, in that instant, thinking about revenge. I was not thinking strategically. I was not thinking much of anything at all, because the truth of what was happening, the specific naked ugliness of it, was landing on me in real time, and it is a very strange experience to watch an institution reveal its full face to you all at once. Not piece by piece, which is the normal way you learn these things, but all at once, in a glass room, at 2:30 on a Thursday, with a copy of your own careful work, annotated in red ink, on the table between you. I nodded. I stood up. I left. The weeks that followed were, without question, the darkest period of my life. And I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I think there is a tendency in stories like mine to skip past the darkness toward the interesting parts. The strategy, the accumulation, the reversal, and in doing so to imply that the darkness wasn't that bad, or didn't last that long, or was merely a phase to be endured rather than a genuine crisis that changed the shape of who I was. I don't want to do that. I owe you the honest version. The letter from the firm to my university arrived before I had even finished processing the termination. My academic advisor called me into her office within 48 hours. The letter had described my conduct as potentially unethical. That specific phrase, deliberately vague, carefully hedged, impossible to argue with precisely because it committed to nothing specific while implying something devastating. My advisor was a decent woman who was clearly uncomfortable with the conversation she was obligated to have. She told me there would be a formal review. She told me the internship credit for the semester would be withheld pending the outcome. She told me she was sorry, and I believed that she meant it, and it changed nothing. I walked home from that meeting through the first real cold of the autumn and tried to think clearly and couldn't. I ate badly for 2 weeks. I slept erratically. I spent a lot of time reading, not productively, just compulsively, the way you read when the words are a way of being somewhere other than where you are. I talked to my parents as little as possible, because telling them the full story would require me to watch them absorb a kind of disappointment that I didn't think I could handle watching. My mother knew something was wrong. She asked carefully each time we spoke, and I told her the internship had ended early and that I was fine. And she let me have the lie because she understood that sometimes people need the lie before they can manage the truth. The university review concluded without formal disciplinary action. There wasn't enough there for formal action, and I think even the administrators involved understood that the letter had been punitive rather than factual. But the investigation itself had taken 2 months, and during those 2 months, the story had circulated the way stories circulate in professional communities, which is to say, imprecisely and irreversibly. By the time I graduated the following spring, I had applied to 11 firms in the city. I received no responses to 4 of them. I received form rejections from 6. I received 1 invitation to an interview, which ended when the interviewer, midway through, abruptly, in a way that told me the decision had been made before I walked in, told me that they had concerns about cultural fit and thanked me for my time. I didn't fully understand what had happened until 6 months later, when a classmate who had taken a position at a mid-tier advisory firm mentioned carefully over drinks that my name was on a list. not an official list. Nothing so explicit, nothing so actionable. An informal one, the kind that circulates through the professional networks of a mid-sized city's financial sector, like a quiet current under the surface of normal conversation. Someone had flagged me. Someone had made a few calls. And in a world where placement is personal, where hiring decisions run on relationships, where a single word from the right person at the right dinner carries more weight than a resume and 3 references combined, being on that list was professionally lethal. They had signed my death warrant in a conversation I would never be able to prove happened. And here is the part I want you to really hear, because I think it is the part that most people underestimate. I almost let them be right. Not in the way of giving up exactly, but there is a version of the story where the system wins, not because it breaks you outright, but because it grinds you down so gradually, so relentlessly, that you reorganize your ambitions around the available ceiling, and call that peace. I saw that version clearly. I saw how easy it would be to find a job, a decent job, an honest job, at some distance from the world that had rejected me, and to build a quiet life there, and to let the fury cool and harden into something more manageable. A story I told occasionally, with controlled bitterness, at dinners with people who would sympathize. I saw that version, and I understood its logic, and some part of me was tempted by it. What stopped me was not courage exactly. It was something closer to stubbornness or maybe pride. The specific, irrational variety of pride that refuses to let the people who were wrong about you remain wrong without consequence. I could have lived with being beaten. I could not live with being erased. So I made a decision, not a dramatic one, not a plan, not yet. I want to be clear about that, because I think retrospective narratives always make the early stages look more intentional than they were. What I decided at that point was simply this. I would go somewhere they couldn't see me. I would get very good at something they would eventually need, and I would wait. The first 2 years were, from the outside, invisible. I found a position at a small regional analytics company, a 20-person firm that worked primarily with logistics and supply chain clients, the kind of work that is genuinely useful and completely unglamorous, and exists well outside the orbits of anyone who eats lunch at the right places. The salary was low enough that I took a second job on weekends doing freelance data work for small businesses, restaurants, a regional retailer, a small medical practice that needed help interpreting its patient flow data. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment and cooked most of my own meals and spent my discretionary income, of which there was very little, on books and on a small collection of industry databases I subscribed to for reasons that I couldn't yet fully justify. I was watching them. I want to be precise about this. I was not obsessing in any way that compromised my functioning. I had made a deliberate decision early in those first years to treat what I was doing as work rather than vendetta, because I understood, I think even then, at 23 and 24, that vendettas are consuming in ways that destroy the person conducting them, that the emotional heat of wanting to destroy something specific tends to make you stupid in proportion to how hot it burns. I didn't want to be stupid. I wanted to be right. So I watched clinically. I maintained a structured file, no different from the kind of competitive analysis file I would have maintained for any business client. I tracked Langford Mercer and Associates the way a researcher tracks a subject: quarterly filings, staff departures, client announcements, industry coverage. I tracked the market in which they operated with the same attention. I tracked the technology landscape of the financial consulting sector, which was, in those years, beginning to shift in ways that the established players, particularly the ones whose reputations had carried them for decades, were very poorly positioned to manage. What I saw, over those first 2 years of watching, confirmed the instinct I had developed even before the internship ended. The firm was not strong, it was simply old, and those two things look identical from the outside. From a distance, an old institution and a strong institution are practically indistinguishable because the markers of power they project, the offices, the client lists, the names on the building, are historical accumulations that decay much more slowly than the actual competitive advantage underlying them. But from close up, if you were looking for the right things, you could see it clearly. Their analytical infrastructure was nearly a decade behind the state of the art. Their junior talent pipeline was deteriorating. The smart people who joined for the name were leaving within 3 years for firms that gave them actual work. Their senior partners were, without exception, men who had built their careers in a market that no longer existed, using methodologies that were becoming obsolete, and who had sufficient comfort and sufficient insulation from the consequences of obsolescence that they felt no particular urgency about any of it. They were, in the language of the market they believed they controlled, a value trap waiting for a catalyst. I spent 2 years becoming the kind of person who could be that catalyst. Let me tell you about the mistake I made in year 3, because I think it matters, and because I think leaving it out would make this story a lie. In year 3, I had built enough of a reputation in the logistics analytics world that I was occasionally being invited to speak at small industry events, local business association gatherings, a regional conference for mid-market supply chain operators, that kind of thing. At one of these events, I met a man named Randall Prescott, who ran a financial communications firm and who, I would later learn, had some indirect professional connections to Langford Mercer. At the time, I didn't know this. He was charming and genuinely knowledgeable, and he expressed real interest in the data methodology I had presented, and we went to dinner after the conference, and I will be honest about this, lonely enough and hungry enough for the kind of intellectual conversation that my daily work life didn't provide, that I was less careful than I should have been. Over the course of several months of occasional contact, I told Randall Prescott considerably more than I should have about the direction of my thinking. Not specifics. I wasn't so far gone as to share specifics, but the general shape of what I was building, the sectors I was focusing on, the thesis I had developed about the vulnerabilities of legacy institutional players. I shared more of that than I should have with a man I hadn't properly vetted. Nothing catastrophic resulted from this, but about 8 months after our initial meeting, I became aware, through a contact at a startup I'd begun advising, that some version of my thesis about legacy consulting firm vulnerability had surfaced in a market analysis document circulating among a particular investor group that had connections to Randall Prescott's network. The document wasn't attributed to me. It wasn't my language. It was close enough to my thinking that the resemblance was unlikely to be coincidental, and distant enough from my specifics that there was nothing actionable about it. What it was, most importantly, was a warning. I stopped having dinners with people I hadn't properly researched. I became, in those months, significantly more careful about the seam between my professional persona and my actual strategic intentions. I developed, consciously and deliberately, a kind of 2-layer presentation. A visible professional identity that was accurate as far as it went but disclosed nothing of the underlying architecture, and an invisible operational reality that I protected with the same discipline I applied to everything else. The mistake with Randall Prescott cost me, at minimum, months of recalibration. But I am grateful for it now, in the way you can be grateful for the lesson that hurts just enough to stick without doing permanent damage. It taught me something I needed to know, that my exposure wasn't only in what I did, it was in what I said. And in a game where the only real edge I had was that they didn't know I was playing, discretion wasn't just an advantage, it was the whole game. I want to stop here and ask you something because I'm genuinely curious. At this point in the story, year 3, 25 years old, a small reputation in a peripheral industry, nursing a long strategic game I couldn't yet be sure would lead anywhere. Would you have stayed in it? Or would the combination of the setback with Prescott, the slow pace, the distance from anything that looked like progress have been enough to make you find a different road? Put it in the comments. I'm not asking rhetorically. I've asked a lot of people this question, and the answers are always more interesting than I expect. I stayed in it. Year 4 was when the first visible piece appeared. I had been, in my spare hours and weekends, developing a data processing methodology for the kind of financial modeling that consulting firms used for valuation assessments, the specific type of analysis that I had, coincidentally, spent considerable time thinking about since a certain 4-page memo I had once written. The methodology was technically novel in a specific and narrow way. It produced more accurate outputs with less proprietary input data, which meant it was particularly useful in market contexts where data access was asymmetric, exactly the kind of context that mid-market companies in complex sectors typically faced. I had published a version of it in a small industry journal under my name without fanfare. It received modest professional attention. Modest professional attention was enough. A woman named April Prescott, no relation to Randall as it turned out, and a person who became one of the most important in my professional life, was a data systems manager at a mid-sized manufacturing company that had become aware of the publication through a professional network. She reached out. We had a series of conversations that were, from the beginning, the most technically substantive I had participated in since leaving university. She understood the methodology immediately, saw its implications faster than I had initially, and had specific, sophisticated questions about implementation that forced me to think harder than any single conversation in the preceding 4 years. She also told me, in our 4th conversation, that her company had recently concluded a consulting engagement with Langford Mercer and Associates that had left significant questions unanswered, and that the valuation model produced by the engagement had been, in her professional judgment, built on assumptions so favorable to a particular outcome that the word independent in the engagement documentation had been an act of considerable optimism. I did not tell her what I knew, but I filed what she told me, and I continued the relationship. Within a year, I had formalized that relationship into a consulting engagement of my own. It was my first real consulting client. It was small, the fee was modest, the scope was limited, but it was the first concrete instance of something I had been building toward, and I felt it very precisely as the first stitch in a piece of work whose final dimensions I could now just barely see. Around the same time, I made a decision that I had been turning over. For the better part of a year, I incorporated Grayson Analytics, LLC, a deliberately unmemorable name, named after nothing, designed to look like nothing, registered without fanfare, in a state with efficient business registration, and a strong tradition of corporate privacy. No website initially. A mailing address at a commercial registered agent. It was, in every visible respect, one of approximately 40,000 small business entities registered in that state that year that nobody would ever have any particular reason to examine. I need to stop here and acknowledge something honestly. I have been describing this process as though it were smooth and purposeful from the beginning, and it wasn't. There were months in year 4 where the gap between where I was and where I needed to be felt so enormous that the rational response seemed like acceptance of a permanently diminished ceiling. There were clients I lost. There were proposals I submitted that were rejected without explanation. There were nights when the 40-minute drive home from a meeting that had gone nowhere felt like a very precise measurement of the distance between who I was and who I needed to become. I did not live glamorously. I did not live well by most definitions. I lived carefully, and I worked constantly, and I did not let myself stop. And the reason I did not let myself stop was not noble, it was specific. Every time I felt the weight of it, the slowness, the distance, the accumulated exhaustion of building something without being able to tell anyone exactly what or why, I thought about a glass room on the 14th floor and a red annotated memo and 8 calm minutes of institutional brutality, and the exhaustion became something else, something usable. Year 5 brought Curtis Mercer back into my life, which I had not expected, and which changed the shape of everything that followed. I want to be careful about how I describe Curtis, because he is a complicated figure in this story, and I don't want to flatten him into something simpler than he was. He had been the nominal supervisor who had passed my memo to Langford, who had participated, whether actively or passively, in the sequence of events that followed. He had been, in some technical sense, complicit, but I had thought about him a lot over the years, and I had come to believe that the more accurate characterization was this. He was a decent man who had reached a critical moment, made the choice that protected his position, and had been living with that choice ever since. These people exist in every institutional structure. They are not the architects of its brutality. They are its load-bearing walls. He had left Langford Mercer 2 years after my internship ended. I had tracked this as part of my regular monitoring. He had started a small independent practice, financial advisory work for mid-market companies, nothing spectacular, functional, and he had apparently been doing reasonably well at it. I knew his current professional address. I had not made contact. He made contact first. He sent me a brief, careful email. He said he had become aware of my published methodology through a professional network. He said he had followed my work from a distance for some time. He said he thought we might have professional interests in common, and asked if I would be willing to have coffee. He did not reference what had happened at the firm. He did not apologize. The email was written in the specific register of a person who is fully aware that an apology is warranted, and has not yet decided whether to offer it. I waited 4 days before I responded. Not strategically. I was genuinely uncertain. Then I thought about it from a position outside the personal, which is to say I asked myself what the information theoretic value of this conversation was, what Curtis Mercer could tell me that I hadn't been able to piece together from outside observation, and the answer was, quite a lot, probably. Inside perspectives on the firm's internal functioning in the years following my departure. Knowledge of client relationships and partnership dynamics. An experienced professional who had sufficient reason to view the institution critically. I met him for coffee. It was awkward in the beginning. We spent 40 minutes discussing the analytics methodology and the mid-market advisory space, before either of us said anything that was actually true. Then Curtis put his cup down and looked at me directly and said, "I want to tell you I'm sorry for what happened." I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, "Tell me what you know about the firm's current client base." He laughed. It was genuine. He understood. Over the following months, Curtis became, carefully and incrementally, a source, not a collaborator. I maintained clear separation between what I was building and what I shared with anyone, Curtis included, but a source. He knew which of the firm's long-term clients had become quietly dissatisfied. He knew which of the senior partnerships were under internal strain. He knew about a technology transition project that Langford Mercer had initiated 3 years earlier and had quietly shelved after the cost projections became difficult to present to the equity partners. He knew about the recruiting problems that had been escalating for 4 years, the difficulty of retaining junior talent that had options, in a market where options were expanding. Every piece of information went into the file. The file was getting interesting. By year 6, Grayson Analytics had 3 full-time employees, 6 regular consulting clients, and a revenue base that was modest by industry standards, but growing at a rate that told me the methodology was genuinely valued in the market, and not merely a function of my ability to sell it. I was working with April on a more formalized engagement that had expanded from its original scope into a broader operational analytics partnership. I had published 2 more industry papers, both of which had generated more attention than the first. My name existed in professional circulation in a way it hadn't in years 1 and 2, present, but not prominent enough to be threatening. In year 6, I also made the second critical strategic move. I had been, quietly, accumulating a small investment position in a data infrastructure startup called Shelton Systems, a 12-person company building tooling for the kind of financial modeling workflow standardization that the consulting industry had been avoiding investing in because the existing players were too comfortable with their proprietary legacy systems to want to commoditize the underlying capability. Shelton had been rejected by every institutional investor it had approached. I understood immediately why. The pitch was technically correct but commercially naive, articulated in engineering language rather than market language, and directed at investors who had no particular reason to want the disruption it promised. I reached out to the founder, a quiet, methodical engineer named Glenn Bradford, whose frustration with the institutional rejection was palpable and whose technical vision was, in my assessment, essentially correct. And I offered a seed investment at a valuation that made the deal work for both of us. I was not, at this point, a person with large reserves of capital. The investment was meaningful relative to what I had, which meant the risk was real. I want to be clear about that because I think stories about this kind of strategic building tend to make the risks invisible in retrospect, when in reality the risks are the whole thing. Investing meaningfully in a 12-person company that every institutional investor had passed on, based on a thesis about market disruption that wouldn't materialize for years, in a period when I was also growing a small consulting firm on a constrained budget, was an act of genuine exposure. It could have been wrong. It could have cost me materially. I ran the analysis obsessively, and then I committed because the analysis pointed clearly and because I had learned, by year 6, that analysis alone gets you to the door, but commitment is what opens it. I want to ask you something here, because I think about this a lot. When you are building something that the world isn't rewarding yet, when everything you are doing looks, from the outside, like a very organized version of running in place, how do you decide when your conviction is clarity and when it's delusion? There's no reliable test. I knew people in those years who were equally convinced and equally systematic and equally patient about projects that never paid off, and I don't think the difference between them and me was purely skill. Some of it was luck, market timing, which client I happened to meet when, which paper landed in which inbox. I don't want to pretend otherwise, but I do think the discipline matters. The ability to build the structure correctly, even when the structure isn't visible from outside, is what makes the luck usable when it arrives, rather than something that passes through your hands without leaving anything behind. The luck that mattered most arrived in year 7, in the form of a market report I almost didn't read. The report was published by a boutique research firm, not one I had used regularly, which was why it almost missed me, and it described emerging consolidation dynamics in the regional mid-market consulting sector with a level of specificity that was, frankly, unusual for a boutique research output. Reading it carefully, I identified something that the authors had noticed but not fully developed, a pattern of client migration away from legacy institutional consultants toward specialized independent practices that combined technical sophistication with more flexible engagement structures. The pattern was early. It was not yet large enough to register as a headline trend, but its trajectory extrapolated against the specific structural characteristics of the legacy players I had been monitoring was very clear. The consolidation was coming, and when it arrived, the firms with the oldest infrastructure and the most entrenched cost structures, the firms most dependent on institutional reputation rather than operational excellence, would be the most exposed. I reread the report 3 times. Then I called April, whose judgment I had by now come to trust in a particular way that is rare, not because she agreed with me, but because she didn't, reliably, and was usually right about where she didn't. She read the report overnight and called me back at 7 the next morning. She said, "You've been building for this." I said, "For 2 years more, maybe." She said, "Tell me what you need." I told her. What I needed at that point was capital and people, in that order. Not large amounts of either. The architecture I had been building didn't require massive scale to be effective, which was one of its advantages over what I was positioning against. What it required was precision. The right investment positions in the right places, and the right professionals in the right roles to execute when the moment arrived. For the capital, I spent the following 6 months in conversations that I had been preparing for without quite knowing it. Conversations with a particular category of investor that I had been identifying and observing throughout the building years. Not institutional investors, individuals, specifically professionals who had been, at various points in their careers, excluded from or marginalized by the same category of institutional structure I was targeting. People who understood from direct experience what it meant to have a door closed on the basis of pedigree rather than performance. People who had, accordingly, built their own paths in the spaces that the established players didn't bother to defend, and who had arrived at a level of professional security that gave them the appetite for a more patient, more contrarian thesis. I found 6 of them. I took their capital carefully and selectively, with agreements structured to preserve my operational control and their patient involvement. None of them were, individually, large investors. Together, they gave me the foundation to do what the next phase required. For the people, I went to April 1st, who agreed to formalize our relationship as a full operational partnership. Then I went looking for the kind of talent I needed, which was, by design, a specific type: extremely capable professionals who had been rejected or sidelined by the institutional tier for reasons that had nothing to do with their competence. I found Denise Shelton at a regional analytics firm where she was the best person on a team that she had no path to leading. I found Louis Langford, no relation, a coincidence I noted with a private and precise satisfaction, consulting independently after being passed over for partnership at a firm where he had built half the client base. I found others like them, a procurement specialist, a market intelligence analyst, a data systems architect who had been building the kind of capability that the big firms claimed to have but didn't. Each of them carried, along with their skills, something I couldn't have hired for directly: a very specific understanding of how the institutional gatekeeping system actually worked from the inside, and a motivation that pure compensation couldn't replicate. I was not naive about this. I understood that shared grievance is not a culture, and that it can become toxic if the strategic narrative doesn't outgrow it. I was deliberate about this from the beginning. The story I told internally from the day the first people joined was not about what we were against. It was about what we were building, a model of professional service that functioned on the opposite set of assumptions from the one that had excluded all of us: excellence visible, not protected; clients treated as partners, not marks; reputation built on output, not name. This wasn't idealism, it was positioning, and it was correct positioning because the market was in the process of becoming willing to pay for it. By year 8, the organization had grown to 14 full-time professionals, 2 of whom had equity, and a client portfolio that was beginning to include names that would have been, 3 years earlier, firmly in the territory of the legacy players. We had lost 2 clients and replaced them with 4. We had turned down 3 engagements because the scope wasn't right for our methodology, a decision that caused real internal debate both times, but that I held firm on, because I understood that the credibility of a methodology built on precision lives and dies on the discipline to not overextend it. We were profitable on a cash basis, growing at a rate I was disciplined about controlling, and beginning to develop a reputation in a specific and valuable segment of the market: Shelton Systems. The data infrastructure startup I had seeded in year 6 had reached a point in its development where the product was technically mature and the commercial case was becoming visible to a broader investor base. Glenn Bradford had grown significantly as an operator. The combination of his technical instincts and the market framing I had helped him develop over 2 years of regular conversations had produced a pitch that was now landing with the kind of investors who, 2 years earlier, hadn't had the context to hear it. A Series A was in progress. My seed position, on paper, had multiplied, but the Shelton investment wasn't primarily about my personal financial return, and it had never been. What Shelton Systems built was, in the most specific terms, tooling that replaced the kind of proprietary legacy infrastructure on which Langford Mercer and firms like it ran their core analytical operations. The product worked on an open standard architecture that dramatically reduced the cost of high-quality financial modeling, which meant that firms with Shelton's tooling could deliver institutional quality analysis at a fraction of what the legacy players charged their clients, with faster turnaround and more transparent methodology. For mid-market clients who had been paying institutional rates for institutional name imprimatur and receiving, in exchange, analytical outputs built on decade-old models by overworked junior associates, this was not a subtle value proposition. Shelton's client list, by year 8, included 4 companies that had, within the preceding 2 years, terminated or significantly reduced consulting engagements with Langford Mercer and Associates. I watched this without comment. I continued to watch. Year 9 was the year I began to feel the weight of what I was carrying in ways I hadn't felt before. And I think this is important to tell you because I think the popular imagination of this kind of long-game strategic project tends to picture the person at the center of it as either constantly energized by it or serenely above it, and neither of those is true. By year 9, I had been living with this for a very long time, not every hour of every day. I want to be precise about this, because the obsessive version of what I was doing would have destroyed both the project and me. But underneath everything, persistently, in the way that a structural condition sits under the surface of daily functioning, there was the awareness of what I was building toward, and the cost of maintaining it in parallel with a life, with relationships, with the ordinary human requirements of presence and attention and emotional availability that long strategic projects compete with in ways nobody warns you about. I had been in a relationship for 3 years that ended in year 9 for reasons that were various and legitimate and complicated, and that I do not entirely blame on the project, but in which the project was genuinely a factor. I am not going to perform regret about this that isn't proportionate to my actual experience of it. It ended. It hurt. And then I absorbed it the way I had learned to absorb things over the preceding 8 years. Not by not feeling it, but by refusing to let the feeling govern the direction of anything. This is not, I want to be clear, a healthy coping mechanism. It is a functional one, under specific circumstances, for a specific purpose. It has costs. I was aware of the cost by year 9 in ways I had not been in year 4. There is a question I want to put to you here, and I want you to think about it seriously. When does discipline become damage? When does patience become avoidance? I don't have a clean answer. I have a messy one, which is that the line is wherever you stop being able to recognize your own emotional state accurately, and that the practice of keeping an honest internal account is the only thing that keeps the discipline from tipping into something pathological. I was doing that. Imperfectly, but I was doing it. And the way I know I was doing it is that by year 9, despite everything, I was not primarily motivated by the original injury anymore. The primary motivation had shifted, gradually, over years, without ceremony, to the thing itself, to what we were building, to the 14 people whose professional trajectories were now, in some real sense, bound up with whether what I had been constructing was as solid as I believed it to be. That shift mattered. It is, I think, the thing that made the final phase possible in the way it had to be, cleanly, without theatrics, from a position of strength rather than rage. Year 10 arrived the way significant years tend to arrive, not dramatically, not with visible markers, but as a gradual arrival of conditions that had been in motion for a long time, reaching a particular critical alignment. In the spring of year 10, 3 things happened in close succession. The first was that Shelton Systems closed a successful Series B, which valued the company at a figure that made my seed position meaningful, not just on paper, but in terms of actual deployable capital. I exercised a partial exit. The proceeds were material. For the first time in 10 years, I was operating with genuine financial reserves, not startup budget constraints, not the careful monthly calculus of a growing but modest professional practice, but real capital with real options attached. The second was that April brought me a report she had compiled based on market intelligence from 5 separate sources, all credible, all independent, all pointing at the same conclusion. Langford Mercer and Associates had lost 7 major clients in the preceding 18 months, 4 of which had migrated to firms in our sector. Their 2 most senior associates outside the founding partnership tier had departed, one to a competitor and one to start their own practice. The firm had attempted to address this with a technology modernization initiative, which they had announced publicly with the kind of institutional confidence that precedes institutional embarrassment. And the initiative had stalled at the specification phase, because the internal committee assigned to oversee it could not agree on scope, which was the predictable consequence of asking people who had built their careers on existing systems to evaluate the replacement of those systems. The third was an article in a regional business publication, brief and carefully worded, noting that Langford Mercer and Associates had reportedly engaged a capital advisory firm to review strategic options for long-term growth, which is the specific phrasing that the business press uses when an institution is looking for capital or partnership because its organic position has become untenable. I read the article twice. Then I called my general counsel, a woman named Jillian Whitmore, who had joined us in year 7 and whose judgment I trusted precisely because she delivered bad news with the same equanimity as good news, and I told her to begin preparing the documentation for a formal approach. She asked, "What kind of approach?" I said, "A controlling one." The mechanics of what happened over the following 4 months were complex, and, in many of their particulars, either confidential or too technical to serve the story well. Let me give you the essential shape. The fund I had been building, initially informal, increasingly formalized across years 7 through 9, now operating with the capital from the Shelton exit and the investor commitments I had secured, had by this point accumulated positions in 7 companies that were either clients of Langford Mercer or participants in supply chains on which Langford Mercer's most significant clients depended. These weren't large positions. They didn't need to be. What they were was strategic, positioned at precisely the points in the commercial ecosystem where, if the positions were exercised in coordinated fashion, the downstream consequences for the firm's core revenue relationships would be material and rapid. In addition to the equity positions, the fund had, over the preceding 18 months, quietly acquired a portfolio of debt instruments from 3 companies that had significant outstanding financial consulting relationships with Langford Mercer. The debt had been available at distressed prices. These were not healthy companies, and the market had priced them accordingly. What the market had not priced in, because the market didn't have the information I had, was that 2 of these companies were about to enter restructuring processes in which the entity controlling their debt would have substantial influence over the outcome of their commercial relationships, including those with their consulting partners. I had not done anything improper. I want to be explicit about this because the mirror image of what they had done to me a decade earlier was a trap I had been conscious of from the beginning and had been vigilant about throughout. Every position had been accumulated on the basis of legitimate market access and properly disclosed investment activity. Every debt acquisition had been executed at market price through standard commercial processes. Jillian had reviewed the entire portfolio from a regulatory standpoint on 4 separate occasions over 2 years. Everything was clean. This mattered to me not only instrumentally, but genuinely. I had spent a decade partly in reaction to an institution that had used its power to do things that weren't right, and I was not willing to replicate that structure, even in service of a purpose I believe was just. But clean doesn't mean small, and the cumulative weight of a decade of precise, patient accumulation, when it finally became visible to the people who had never thought to look for it, was considerable. The introduction of the fund, to the Langford Mercer board was arranged through the capital advisory firm they had hired. Which is to say, they arranged it themselves, without understanding what they were arranging. The fund appeared from the outside like exactly what they were hoping for. A sophisticated private capital entity with a coherent thesis about the mid-market financial consulting sector and a demonstrated track record of disciplined investment. The capital advisory firm had done its due diligence on the fund's recent history and found, accurately, that it was well managed, growing, and credibly positioned. What the due diligence had not revealed, because the historical corporate structure I had built across the founding years was deliberately opaque on this specific point, was the identity of the fund's managing principal. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. The Langford Mercer boardroom was on the 14th floor. I want to be precise about how I felt on the morning of that meeting, because I think the honest answer is more interesting than the dramatic one. I was not exhilarated. I was not serenely composed. I was something closer to focused in the way that I'm always focused before something that matters. A slightly heightened stillness, a particular clarity of attention. I had been preparing for this meeting in one way or another for 10 years, and that meant the preparation was complete, and what I felt on the morning of it was the specific calm of a person who has done everything that can be done, and is now simply present for what comes next. I wore the same kind of clothes I always wore to client meetings. I brought the same kind of documents I always brought. I arrived in the lobby of the building, which I had not entered since I walked out of it at age 22, and I gave my name at the security desk and took the elevator to the 14th floor. The boardroom was not the same glass room where the termination meeting had happened. It was larger, at the end of the hall, with a view of the city that was genuinely impressive. Victor Langford was seated at the head of the table. Gerald Whitmore was to his left. 3 other board members I recognized from regulatory filings were present. The capital advisory firm's representative, a man named Warren Carlyle, who had been professional and straightforward in all our prior communications, was seated to one side. Warren Carlyle stood when I entered the room and said my name and said it was good to finally meet in person. Victor Langford looked at me. I watched him process what he was seeing. The recognition was not immediate. It had been 10 years, and I was a different person in every visible respect from the 22-year-old he had dismissed in 8 minutes and forgotten before the elevator reached the lobby. But it came. I could see it arrive, first as a flicker of something, displacement, uncertainty, and then as I set my documents on the table and sat down and looked at him directly as something more complete, a comprehension, and in its wake, something I had not predicted and have thought about many times since. Not anger, not aggression, but a specific quality of stillness that I recognized as a person arriving at the outer boundary of what they understand about how the world works. I let the silence hold for a moment. Then I said, calmly and without theatrics, "Mr. Langford, it's good to see you again." Gerald Whitmore said, "You've met?" Victor Langford said nothing. I said, "Briefly, about 10 years ago, in this building actually." I paused. I was an intern. The word landed with the precision of something that had been measured for exactly this drop. Warren Carlyle, to his considerable professional credit, recovered first. He moved the meeting forward, introduced the agenda, referenced the materials we had distributed in advance, and for the next 20 minutes we worked through the fund's market thesis and portfolio overview in a way that was entirely professional and that made visible, with each page, the breadth and depth of what had been quietly assembled over a decade. I watched Victor Langford's face as the documents moved across the table. I watched him understand, incrementally, the architecture of what he was looking at. I watched the moment, somewhere around page 7 of the portfolio summary, where the fund's positions in the client ecosystem became apparent. When he stopped performing composure and became, instead, simply still. The kind of stillness that is not choice, but the absence of available alternative. Gerald Whitmore, who was sharper in some respects and slower in others, said at one point, "These positions, the debt instruments, when were these acquired?" I said, "Over approximately 18 months, beginning about 2 years ago." He said, "And the equity positions in the operating companies?" I said, "Various dates. The earliest is from year 6 of the fund's operation." He looked at the document. He looked at me. He said, "That's," and then stopped. I said nothing. I had learned in 10 years that silence is the most powerful thing in a room when the person on the other side of the table is doing the mathematics. The mathematics were simple, ultimately. The fund controlled a sufficient portion of the commercial ecosystem on which the firm depended that any realistic restructuring path, any genuine strategic growth option, required either the fund's active cooperation or the fund's active neutrality. Neither was available without an agreement, and I was, at that moment, the only person in the room with the authority to provide an agreement. Victor Langford spoke for the first time since my opening line. He said, "What do you want?" I want to tell you what I felt in that moment. because I think it is the most honest and most important part of this entire story. I had imagined, in various forms across various years, what it would feel like to be here. I had expected something cathartic, some release of 10 years of accumulated pressure into a moment of defined, visible consequence. What I felt instead was something much quieter and, in retrospect, much more real. It was completion, not satisfaction. Satisfaction implies a need that gets resolved, and I had spent enough years working on myself to know that whatever need had originally driven this project had long since been replaced by something else. What I felt was completion, the closing of a specific arc, the arrival at the end point of a particular kind of work, with the full knowledge that the arrival didn't change who I was, and didn't resolve anything fundamental, and didn't give back what had been taken. But it was complete. And completeness, when you have been working towards something for 10 years, is its own kind of experience. I answered his question. The answer was precise and documented, and contained nothing personal. It was a commercial proposal with terms, and it addressed the situation from a position of structural leverage in a way that left them with options, none of which were good for them, and all of which required my participation. The meeting continued for another 90 minutes. There were lawyers involved subsequently. There were additional meetings. The specific outcome is confidential in ways that are material to the agreement, and I will respect that. What I will tell you is what happened to the people involved, because I think that is the part that actually matters. Victor Langford retired from the firm's management within 18 months of that Tuesday morning. The announcement was described in the business press as a planned succession. I imagine it felt different from the inside. Gerald Whitmore remained on the board in a reduced capacity. I had no particular interest in his fate, beyond the indifference of structural irrelevance, which is the most honest thing I can say about it. Bradley Caldwell, who had received that private lunch on the first day of my internship while I sat in the orientation presentation, had left the firm 4 years earlier and was, by the time of the meeting, running a small family office operation that managed his father's real estate holdings. We had no contact. We have had no contact since. Curtis Mercer attended the announcement of the restructuring agreement at a professional event and found me afterward. He shook my hand. He said, "I didn't know it was you." I believed him. I told him that was the point. April Whitmore, April, who had been there since year 4, who had read the boutique research report overnight and called me at 7 in the morning, who had built half of what we had built and deserved full credit for all of it, is now a managing partner. The firm she helps lead has grown to 41 professionals and has a client portfolio that would have been, a decade ago, unreachable by any measure. She is the best strategic mind I have ever worked with, and I tell her that regularly, and she tells me not to be sentimental, and she is right. Glenn Bradford sold Shelton Systems in year 11 to a strategic acquirer at a valuation that returned meaningful multiples to its investors and, perhaps more importantly, embedded the infrastructure he had built into the operating architecture of a significant portion of the financial consulting sector. The technology that Langford Mercer had refused to invest in, that every institutional investor had passed on, that existed only because a 25-year-old with a grudge and a thesis had written a check that was too large relative to his available capital. That technology is now in the backbone of dozens of firms. He sends me a message on the anniversary of our initial investment. Every year, I respond every year. Some things you don't let become routine. Denise Shelton is still with us. Lewis, the procurement specialist, the market intelligence analyst. Most of the people who came in during the building years are still there. Not all of them. Some left for opportunities that were right for them, and I was glad for them when they did. But most stayed, and I think they stayed for the same reason I didn't stop in year 4 or year 7, because the thing we were building was, whatever else it was, actually good work, not just strategically, actually good. I want to tell you something that I haven't been able to make feel neat or resolved, because it isn't. What winning feels like when you have pursued something with the discipline and the patience and the personal cost that this required is not what you expect. It is not triumphant. It is not empty. I have heard people say that revenge is empty, and I don't think that's quite right either. It is more complicated than either of those. It is the specific experience of discovering that the thing you organized a decade of your life around has a backside, and the backside is just ordinary life, with its ordinary requirements and its ordinary weight, and you have to inhabit that the same way you always did, without the structure that the project provided. I am not the person I was at 22, sitting in a parking garage, not knowing how to start the engine. I'm also not entirely sure, some days, that I know what I am instead. The project is complete. The company is real. The people are real. The outcomes are real. And there is a specific, particular cost to spending a decade building a ghost empire designed to dismantle someone else's. It ghosts some of you, too. The parts of you that require presence, immediacy, the ordinary warmth of being fully somewhere, rather than always also somewhere else. Those parts don't come back automatically when the project ends. You have to go looking for them deliberately, and they are not always where you left them. I think about that Tuesday morning sometimes still. The 14th floor, the window, Victor, Langford's face at the moment of comprehension, the 8-minute meeting that started all of it, and the 9-hour meeting that ended it. The symmetry is not lost on me. Institutions, in the end, are just rooms with certain people in them, making certain decisions. The power resides in the room, and the room belongs to whoever has been patient enough to buy the building. I bought the building. But here's the thing I want you to take from this. If there is one thing, I bought it not by becoming something ruthless, not by becoming a version of the thing that tried to destroy me. I bought it by becoming something more capable, by building something real, by treating the decade of apparent obscurity as preparation rather than punishment. The firm that crossed me off a list believed that removing me from their world was the end of the story. What they could not account for, what institutions that run on pedigree and protection can never quite account for, is that being removed from their world was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it meant I had to build a different one, and I built a better one. I want to ask you one final question, and I want you to think about it honestly and put it in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious how people with different experiences answer it. If you had been in that conference room, not at 22, but at 32, or wherever you are now, with everything you know, and you had that same leverage, and Victor Langford asked you what you wanted, what would you have done? Would you have taken the clean institutional victory? Would you have wanted something more personal? Would you have walked away entirely just to have walked away? Tell me. I've asked myself this question many times, and my answer changes depending on the year. My answer in this year is this. I wanted what I took, not the money, not the position, not the public acknowledgement, though all of those followed. I wanted the proof that a 22-year-old in a parking garage, shaking with nothing, had read the situation correctly, that what he found in those financial records had been real, that what was done to him had been deliberate, and that the system that had seemed, from inside that parking garage, to be impenetrable and permanent was, in fact, neither of those things. It was simply old. And old things, if you are willing to wait long enough and work hard enough and build carefully enough in the places they can't see, eventually encounter what was always going to be true, that the past doesn't protect you from the future, it just delays it. I don't tell this story often. I tell it now because I think there are people who need to hear it, and not for the reason most people would expect. Not for the revenge, for the parking garage, for the 40 minutes of sitting in the car not knowing how to start the engine, for the first 2 years and the mistake with Randall Prescott and the months of invisible work that generated no visible reward, for the relationship that didn't survive the project, for the specific, particular quality of long patience that is nothing like the patience they describe in productivity books, not calm, not serene, not even always disciplined, but real and hard and sustained at a cost that only you can account for fully. If you are in your parking garage right now, if you are the person in the moment before the story begins, sitting with the weight of something that was done to you and trying to find the engine, I want to tell you this precisely. You are not where you will be. The thing that feels like a death sentence is a misreading of time. The people who closed the door did not own the building, they were just standing in front of it. Go around. If you're in a situation where someone tried to close every door on you, put it in the comments. I read everyone.